Whew, that was a cold one. I hope everybody made it, and after that ordeal, I'm sure I speak for many when I say I want to soak up the sun. But as that very memorable Christmas of 2022 enters our rearview mirror, next Christmas already looms. Just 364 days away. It seems like the perfect time to thank you all for being here and to wish you a very Merry Christmas Eve. Eve, 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 Eve. Eve, 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 Eve. Eve, 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 Eve. Eve, 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 Eve. Eve, 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 it's the bass. Eve, 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 Eve. Eve, 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 everybody. All right, this riff is pretty cool. Grab an E power chord, that's the A string 7th fret, and definitely 3 fingers, not 2, because you're going to give it a strum. Then remove your ring and pinky fingers and smush down your pointer fingers. So we're just going to have 7, 7, 7 on A, D, G, and then put them back. Then B on the 2nd fret of the A string. And then we're going to A, but we're going to get there in steps. It's going to start with open A, D2, and pinky finger on G4 right where it was. And then into a normal A power chord there. So and notice how I hit that A bass note, then strum the funny chord, and then strum the regular chord. Bass funny, regular. There's another quick option for this that I prefer, and I perused some live versions and saw that sometimes they did this instead. So this is totally fair game. Instead of your ring and pinky finger coming off, just your ring finger. I prefer that, but up to you. And so on. There's that little wiggly lead line, right? I think it's just the D string 979. Hard to hear because it's kind of smushed beneath the while that's going on, but we can assume that it does that, or it's a great thing to do either way. Followed by definitely B9, G9. Bum, bum, ba-dum. Bum, bum, ba-dum. Hey, we're already to the chorus. I'm going to call these chords out, but if you want to play it somewhere different than I do, that's completely fine. For instance, if I play B here, and you want to play B like that, or C sharp minor, that versus that, it's all good. Here we go. E to B. And now we get a big, huge tour of the key of E, which is the key we're in. We're going to go F sharp minor, G sharp minor, A, C sharp minor, B. One more time. Here we go. E to B. And the big tour. F sharp minor, G sharp minor, A, C sharp minor, B. I want to give you another option for that tour section I've been saying. The thing about standard tuned guitars is that they really like the key of E, which is the key we're in, because the root and the fifth of the key of E happen to be E and B, which happen to be the two highest open strings. So I got this, by the way, while I was watching some live versions and thought it was really cool, so I wanted to share it with you. So if we take a look at what our D string and our G string are doing when we play these, big bar chords, you'll see we've got D4 and G2. But we can just take the D4 and the G2 and leave those, again, the root and fifth, E and B, shimmering out. It'd be 2 frets higher for G sharp minor. But when we get to A, you'll see it's 7-6 instead of 7-5. So it's going to be that. C sharp minor is going to be 11-9. And then B could be, well, you might switch back to your big bar chord at B. You might play 9-8 open, open. Or you might put your pointer finger back on the B string and do some sus4 action there on the G string. So now we have give you a few options for this bridge section too, the section, because there's a lot of cool possibilities and there's a few really cool things to talk about. Firstly, there's an organ piano guy or gal person in the studio recording, and he or she is playing E, B, D, A. So although there's no guitar doing that in the studio recording, those are the chords, and you can do that if you want. Every single live version I perused, and not on the studio record, the guitar is going a 2-finger E power chord, so 7-9, to 6-9, to 5-7, that's a D power chord, to 4-7. So, right? And I want to tell you right now how this is this. By the way, isn't that the soundtrack from Ninja Turtles 1 when Casey Jones and Raphael are about to fight for the first time? Were you some kind of a bogey? Anyways, when we do this, we've got clearly an E power chord. The root E and the B fifth an E power chord. But when we change it from 7 to 6, from E to D sharp, we now have, well, D sharp and B still, which just happen to be the root B and major third D sharp from our B chord. So when we go from this to this, we go from root 5th E to 3rd root B. So even though this doesn't look like much of a B chord, it's 2 of the 3 notes you need to make a B chord, and we're going to call it B. Similarly, when we take it down here, we go from root 5th D to 3rd root A. So whether you're doing this thing or this thing, for the bridge, we're going to go E, B, D, A. E, B, then G power chord, A power chord. And every single version I watched, didn't matter what the guitar was doing, they switched to the G and the A power chords. You could play G and A, that'd be fine, but E, B, D, A, E, B, G power chord, and A power chord. Back into the chorus. But that is not what happens on the studio recording, and the thing that happens on the studio recording is not the thing which I prefer, but here it is anyways. It's going to be the guitar part. It's going to be an E octave chord, so A7, G9. That's 2 E notes. We're going to move up 2 frets to F sharp, the octave chord, which is the 5th from our B chord, so that's why that works. Down to the D octave chord on 5-7. And C sharp on 4-6. So even though that's not the one I prefer, now if you've got 3 guitar players in the room, everybody has something to do. And those are all the pieces, so go forth and do that, and please do not forget to have an incredible Christmas Eve.